economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
This is not a test. This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual purge sanctioned by the U.S. government. Weapons of Class 4 and lower have been authorized for use during the purge. All other weapons are restricted. Government officials of ranking 10 have been granted immunity from the purge and shall not be harmed. Commencing at the siren, any and all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 continuous hours. Police, fire, and emergency medical services will be unavailable until tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. when the purge concludes. Blessed be our new founding fathers and America, a nation reborn. May God be with you all.
Summer is upon us, and so it's time for our regular summer reading series. Now, often when we think of books for this season, we think about beach-friendly novels full of adventure and romance. But since this year marks the 50th anniversary of many pivotal events in the civil rights movement, so-called Freedom Summer, we decided to dive into books that explore the theme of freedom. And we're going to start with one of the cornerstones of the movement, nonviolent resistance. You will have seen this in countless old news clips and even depicted in movies like The Butler. You'll have seen activists courageously withstanding abuse by fellow citizens and law enforcement. But what you did not see and might not have known about until now is that passive resistance in public protest did not necessarily mean an unwillingness to use force to protect themselves from violence in other circumstances. This hiding in plain sight story is recounted by the author, Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. in his new book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. And Professor Cobb is with us now. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
What gave you the idea for this book? Or for this history, really, to kind of dig into this?
Well, as a writer, I'm very much concerned with how the history of the Southern freedom movement or civil rights movement is portrayed. And I'm very conscious of the gaps in the history. And one important gap in the history, in the portrayal of the movement, is the role of guns in the movement. I worked in the South. I lived with families in the South. There was never a family I stayed with that didn't have a gun. I know from personal experience and the experiences of others that guns kept people alive, kept communities safe, and all you have to do to understand this is simply think of black people as human beings, and they're going to respond to terrorism the way anybody else would.
Now, early in the book, you start off explaining how guns became an important part of Southern culture. The fact is that during this era of kind of intense repression, blacks were specifically forbidden from having guns previously, and those were among the things that they sought to acquire. How is that important, or why did that become important?
Well, first, I would say that right from the beginning of the country's history, going all the way back, say, to the Jamestown colony in the 17th century and the days of slavery, guns and weapons were forbidden to black people. I mean, weapons, for obvious reasons, are associated with rebellion, and one of the big fears in the South was slave rebellion. After the Civil War, guns were, you had all these black soldiers who had fought in the Union Army coming back home with weapons. So states, particularly in what's called the First Reconstruction, attempted to disarm blacks, and that was not all that successful. You see, if we were really doing a deep look at this period, say between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War I, you'd see instance after instance of blacks in the rural South fending off the Ku Klux Klan and others with weapons. It's the period what historian Vincent Harding, who just passed away, called the period of great black protest.
In the early 1900s, an oil boom in Oklahoma made Tulsa a real estate magnet. Unwelcome in the city's downtown, enterprising black entrepreneurs built up the neighborhood of Greenwood into a booming community. Sadly, the Negro Wall Street, as it was called then, would become the casualty of fraught race relations.
In May of 1921, a young black man entered an elevator where a young white woman was the elevator operator. They were in the elevator alone, and someone heard her scream. He was accused of accosting her.
The young man was arrested and taken to the courthouse for holding. When black Tulsans in Greenwood heard that a lynch mob of white people was gathering at the courthouse, they headed there to defend the young man. In the middle of a tense standoff, a single gunshot rang out. The residents of Greenwood retreated, but that didn't end the tension. The next day, thousands of white people descended, looting Greenwood's businesses and setting fire to homes. Black residents fought back. The National Guard arrived, imposed martial law, then arrested nearly half of Greenwood's population.
This became known as the Tulsa Race Riot, one of the most violent race riots in our nation's history.
The young man was released from the courthouse after the riots ended. The charges against him were dropped when the elevator operator failed to appear at court. Shockingly, nearly 80 years would pass before an official report would be commissioned. The report found that more than 1,200 homes had been burned, and it estimated that up to 300 people had been killed, the overwhelming majority black. Recently, a typewritten eyewitness account of the riot, donated to the Smithsonian, described airplanes dropping firebombs from the sky, black people being gunned down in the streets, and it posed the question, is the city in conspiracy with the mob? Those who survived faced homelessness and the daunting task of attempting to rebuild in a city that didn't want Greenwood and all that it symbolized. Slowly, Greenwood's residents recovered, though the Black Wall Street never returned to its glory days, and memories of the violence continue to haunt descendants even to this day. A full century later, some are still searching for the dead.
Tulsa, the African-American community in Tulsa was relatively prosperous, well-educated. I mean, they had done everything that they were supposed to do in terms of the American dream. You work hard, you save your money, you go to school, you buy property. I mean, this is what they had done under horrific conditions. I mean, when you look at the context of what Black America looked like at the time, the fact that they were able to do this is one of the things that we herald in terms of when we talk about the immigrant story, right? But instead, this created such seething resentment in Tulsa that you had Black doctors, Black attorneys, Black businessmen. I mean, in fact, this area of Tulsa was known as Black Wall Street, to give you some sense of how much it held in terms of value, in terms of esteem, in terms of worth. But that resentment in Tulsa was so intense and that it was just waiting for a spark to just ignite it. That spark was a Black messenger was delivering a message. You know, they had messengers back in the day, was delivering a message downtown. And he gets in the elevator, and there's a white woman in the elevator. I believe she was the elevator operator. And from the first floor through the third floor, I mean, the elevator may have bumped or something, and he hit her a little bit, but he didn't hit her, he just kind of brushed her against it. She yelled, "Rape." Now, to understand what the charge of rape means when a white woman yells rape against a Black man in this period, because part of understanding the violence that African Americans faced was to deal with the issue of what was called the sanctity of white womanhood. And that sanctity of white womanhood said that all white women had to be protected from Black beast, so-called Black beast. And when she yelled rape, now the charge was absolutely improbable from the first floor to the third floor. Improbable. But it was the spark. They couldn't wait because he was the son of a prominent Black businessman. So they hauled him, the police hauled him down to the station. Well, the Black elite came down to the station going, you know, this is my son, this is my boy. My son wouldn't do this. What's his bail? And like, oh, uppity, how dare you come down here? How dare you? And because the African American community sensed that the sense of anger and violence was rising, it wasn't one or two that came down, there were several of them that came down. And like, oh, so what, are you gonna storm the jail? They said, no, but we're here for justice. We're here for justice. And then the lynch mob began to form in Tulsa. It was like, oh, these are some uppity Negroes who need to be put back in their place. And the violence began. Black Tulsa was, the lynch mob rode in, but they also came in airplanes, dropping bombs on Tulsa, Black Tulsa. There are descriptions and depictions of African Americans being decapitated, being forced to kneel down and just having their heads severed. There are the pictures of the strafings, of the bombings, of the shootings. Nobody's quite sure what the death toll is. But when you look at the pictures, what you see is an area that had once been thriving. What we say is the American dream, absolutely leveled by the violence, by the lynch mobs, by the airplanes, by the bombs, leveled. Black Tulsa has never recovered. As the bombings are happening, as the violence is happening, as Tulsa is on fire, the governor of Oklahoma is like, whoa, maybe, we should. The feds are looking up going, this is not our issue. I bet you, wow. Nothing we can do here. And that is so indicative of the imbalance that has happened in terms of justice, in terms of rights, in terms of the protection of basic civil and human rights for African Americans in the United States.
Welcome back. New at 6, a Tulsa family says goodbye to the last local survivor of the 1921 race riot. Hazel Jones lived to be 99 and spent the last decades advocating for peace in Oklahoma.
Bringing awareness and bringing acknowledgement of what happened and some kind of resolution.
Two Works for You reporter Megan Allison sat down with her family and shows us the legacy she left behind.
It was a story that Hazel Jones kept quiet for years. Fearing a Ku Klux Klan presence in Tulsa, she stayed silent over the violence that shook this community. But once she spoke out, peace was a mission she pushed for until her final days.
And there's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of dialogue that needs to be had.
The Jones family says the 1921 riot shaped their grandmother into the person she was meant to be. She was only 2 years old during what's described as the worst incident of racial violence in American history. But relatives say she carried the memory her entire life.
Remember as a little girl, seeing the cross burning. I think that was one of the most vivid things that stuck in her mind. Also, the screams, not knowing what was happening.
On that day, gangs of white Tulsans lit fires throughout the African-American community of Greenwood. Thousands said goodbye to their homes, and hundreds lost their lives. Almost 100 years later, the Jones family says there's still work to do.
That we can all come together as one and stop being so divided, because these many years later, we're still divided.
Hazel's grandchildren say in some Tulsa neighborhoods, that division is clearly visible.
I think there's a mentality of separation between different parts of the city, the north side, other parts of the city.
Hazel fought for reparations for survivors of the riot for years, even marching in Washington, D.C. But her family sees her as more than just an advocate. They tell us she was the kindest person they ever knew and the glue of the family.
And this is the meeting place. This is where everybody came to gather around, and especially on Sundays, this is where the place to be was. So it's going to be an adjustment since she's not here anymore.
There will be a service for Jones tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. at the North Peoria Church of Christ, but the family expects a large crowd to honor her. Reporting in the Greenwood District, Megan Allison, 2 Works for You.
After we got to high school, I decided, he was like, man, you got to get out this band, man. Come get in this band where I'm in. I was like, and we was getting ready to graduate. We was trying to figure out what college we was going to. Everybody's going to different colleges, and I said, okay. So I went and got in his band, and it was okay,
His band was already called the Gap Band?
It wasn't a Gap Band at that time, but it was like we ended up calling it that, the Greenwood, Archer, and Pine Street Band.
I was going to ask you what's the cultural significance of the group name, the Gap Band. I was going to ask you what does that mean?
Greenwood, Archer, and Pine Street Band.
This is all neighborhoods.
Greenwood was where Black Wall Street was. Mm-hmm. All rich black people, multi-millionaires, had their own bus companies, had their own grocery stores, had their own black-owned banks.
That's right.
Everything there. And then
the white man came and blew it all up.
Burned it up. Because this black dude and this white chick was having sex, going with each other, but that was really hush-hush in the 20s. And they was in the same building. They come down the elevator together and open up on that ground floor, and all them white people was there, so she come out screaming.
He raped me.
Well, he just come out screaming, so they just grabbed him and dragged him. So, because they like, you ain't supposed to be in no elevator with no white woman. It just ain't supposed to be like that. So they couldn't say that they had been doing anything, so they just beat him, and then they started burning things.
Well, you were around then, right?
Huh?
Were you in Tulsa at that time?
No, that was in the 20s.
Okay, damn, I'm bugging.
Yeah. My grandmother and them knew about that, told me that story, and they burnt out everything, and then they started. The police was knocking on doors, and if black people answer the door, they shoot them, kill them. Yeah.
Yep.
So they're trying to wipe out all of North Tulsa, and
that's such an important story that I feel like still hasn't been told the right way. I think people need to see that. They kind of flirted with it in that the HBO show The Watchmen. But it's like, people need to see that, because black people have built these great communities, but they've been snatched away from us.
Absolutely. Well, the white community was really mad at this black community because they had everything, didn't need anything. They didn't have to come out of that community for nothing. Buses, cabs, and they was mad because the black people wouldn't go and work for them anymore. Because they had it all.
Is that story told in Tulsa a lot? Because I always wondered, what was taught to kids growing up in Tulsa?
Well,
to teach them the importance of having their own.
Basically, it was not supposed to be talked about at all. So the blacks that lived long said, don't ever bring that up, ever.
Really?
Oh yeah, because if the white police officers, if you said, "Tell me what happened," and if they started talking about what happened, then they just kill them.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what was happening.
Boy, but they know how to stop black progress, boy.
They did, and then they rebuild and then they burn them out again. So they never say that again. But
so when he was told about it was in hush whispers almost.
Yeah, they was saying it, but you can't ever talk about this, because but it was one white dude that was still living and one black lady still living, and it was one of my daughter's great grandmother, and she called. They used to ask her about it. She's like, "Baby, don't you ever repeat this." He said, "Grandma, how you still living?" She said, "Because I never said anything, because my mother said, don't ever, ever talk about this."
Damn.
Yeah. And so she was one of the ones that was living, and it was one white dude that was living, and he kind of didn't tell the story right, and they said, he didn't say it right. But we all know what happened. And so she said, the reason why I'm living, because I never told them. They wanted to they tried to do interviews with her, take pictures, asked her about it. She's like, no, I don't have anything to say. That just followed her all the way. She was 106 years old when she died. And she died 7 years ago.
Wow. Man. What is kept?
And she was a little girl.
Like many of your listeners and viewers are familiar with the Tulsa Massacre of 1921.
Right.
Now, the story that you get on Facebook and YouTube and all these other things is that the white community was jealous of the wealthy black community, so they burned it down. It wasn't that simple. Here's some actual facts on the subject, okay? That riot started on May the 31st, 1921, when a black man named Dick Rowland was in an elevator and he either tripped over or fell on the white female elevator operator named Sarah Page, and she screamed and he ran out of the elevator. Well, here's the part that you don't hear, is that a group of black World War I veterans went to the jailhouse armed to the teeth to prevent Dick Rowland from being lynched. And at the same time, white people had these rumors that black people were going to shoot up the town. So both of them met at the courthouse in Tulsa, and there was a brave brother by the name of Obie Mann who had his gun. And so one of the white men walked up to him and said, "Nigga, what you gonna do with that gun?" And he said, "Crack, I'm gonna use it." And it was on.
All right.
So they had a shootout. And so then during the shootout, there was a one-legged black man named Horace Peg Leg Taylor who got up on a hill in the black community and hopping around on one leg with his rifle, he was picking them off left and right. So these people didn't just surrender the community without a fight. What happened though was that the white community, when seeing all this going on, they went on the telephone and on the telegraph wires and got reinforcements from nearby communities, and that's how the community was burned out, because they were outnumbered. Now, the Tulsa newspapers were trying to give the impression that it was all the fault of the Negroes. But a couple of things to that most people don't know. There was this brave and beautiful sister, Miss Mary Jones Parrish. You see her right here?
Yeah.
Okay. She was a school teacher, and she wrote this. She told the truth about Tulsa in this book called Events of the Tulsa Disaster by Mary Jones Parrish. So then there was a black lawyer by the name of B.C. Franklin, known as Buck Franklin. The city was going to take the land that was destroyed and use it for other purposes. Buck Franklin, black lawyer, and his legal team got together and sued the city so that to prevent them from taking the black people's land, and the black people rebuilt Tulsa, the Black Wall Street area, into something even better that they had before. And the great Dr. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, came to Tulsa in 1926. And when he saw how those black people rebuilt that community, thanks to Buck Franklin and all these brave black people, he said, "Tulsa, I bow my head and take off my hat to you."
Beautiful story.
Yep. And let me add this too. Wait, there's a coda to this. Buck Franklin had a son by the name of John Hope Franklin. And John Hope Franklin was like Henry Louis Gates is, my friend Dr. Henry Louis Gates is today. He was the major black historian of his time.
And the other thing I do want to add, I went to Tulsa, Oklahoma to show my film. The lady who introduced me, the guy you said they accused of bumping into the white lady on the elevator,
Dick Rowland,
was her great uncle.
Woo!
All right. She tells the story, and everybody, it's all history, so it all gets kind of convoluted and what have you. That him and the white chick was dating.
Sarah Page. Yeah.
Him and her was dating.
Sarah Page.
He would get on the elevator, kiss on her, fondle her, and everything like that. And then when
feeling
somebody
up
else
on her,
got
huh?
on that, but he had to stop. This one time, he didn't stop in time. The white man saw it, went back and told people. Well, the end of that story is that brother and the white girl got married in Massachusetts.
Now that I didn't know.
Patent filings by black investors in America declined noticeably following the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. That is just one fact out of some fascinating research on black wealth creation that our Planet Money podcast has been looking into. Here's Mary Childs.
One of the big ways economies can grow is innovation, new ideas, technologies. But when Lisa Cook was a PhD candidate learning about this theory, she thought something was missing. Her professors seemed to think that the main thing you needed to spur innovation was strong patent laws on the books.
No, it won't work that way. No, it seemed naive.
So she set out to prove that you need more than laws. She studied black inventors from 1870 to 1940.
You can have laws on the books and not enforce them and never have growth.
She knew that there were laws on the books protecting black inventions, but they weren't enforced like they were for white inventors. Also, she knew there were other things that, she hypothesized, might stifle innovation, like segregation, racial violence, and, the most extreme form, lynchings. So she started to find all the patent filings she could, and then figure out the race for each of the filer for all of them, all 2 million filings.
It took me a year to identify the names and then a year to match them to the data, and then another year to fail at that.
Eventually, she has her data, and it lines up as this chart that shows African American innovation over time. At first, the line went up. The 14th Amendment had passed, promising equal protection under the law, and African Americans made a lot of gains, holding office, owning property, and filing patents at about the same pace as white inventors. Until 1900. Following Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling that legalized a so-called separate but equal America. States passed laws that pushed Black Americans into not at all equal homes and schools, or cut off access altogether. The line charting Black innovation dropped sharply. And then, a few years later, it got a little weird. Cook sees something she can't explain. Her data were screaming at her that something happened in 1921. And she realizes that year was one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history, the Tulsa Race Massacre. This one neighborhood in Tulsa had become famous as a bustling, wealthy community of African Americans. But in late May of 1921, mobs of white men invaded and massacred residents. This haven of Black affluence burned to the ground.
Tulsa demonstrated that no one would help them. No one. The local government failed. The state government failed. The U.S. government failed. At every single level.
The message was clear. The government would not provide even the most basic protections to Black Americans. Not for their lives, not for their property, certainly not for their inventions.
If I'm a Black inventor, why would I ever invent anything if I thought the intellectual property was never going to be defended? You don't feel safe anywhere, but also my livelihood might be in jeopardy.
After that, patent filings by African Americans dropped off. Not just in Tulsa, but across the country.
If the Black Wall Street that everybody knew about, if it weren't protected, why would I be protected?
Clearly, just having laws on the books is not enough. And the implications of her findings are huge. It's generations of lost wealth for Black Americans, and also for the entire country. the U.S. lost out on more than 1,100 inventions from black inventors, about equivalent to a Netherlands. So, Cook shows her work to 3 Nobel-winning economists. They say, "This is big, publish this." But when she tries, she finds some of the same obstacles that she was studying still present in her own field. The comments that she gets back from journal reviewers aren't about econometrics. They're basic confusion about what it's like to be black. Like, they kept asking,
why would you care about a lynching that happened in a different state? Why would you care? The kind of fear and terror that black people knew then and that they know now was not even fathomable.
She ended up writing a Black history paper on top of her economics paper. Cook says getting published usually takes 2 to 3 years. Her paper took 10 before getting published in 2014. A few weeks ago, Lisa Cook got promoted to full professor at Michigan State. There are more than 9,000 full professors of economics in the country. About 20 of those are black. Mary Childs, NPR News.
And so then during the shootout, there was a one-legged black man named Horace Peg Leg Taylor who got up on a hill in the black community and hopping around on one leg with his rifle, he was picking them off left and right.
Today it's time to stop singing and start swinging.
We're coming to get our check.
You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio. And I'm your host, JohnGHorse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. P.A.R. is a family-friendly information distribution program seeking to inform non-white people, in particular black classifieds, and assisting in counter-racist codification. The title of today's episode is The 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma Race Clash, The Legend of Horace Peg Leg Taylor, and the Myth of Black American Cowardice. One more time. The title of today's episode is The Tulsa, Oklahoma Race Clash, The Legend of Horace Peg Leg Taylor, and the Myth of Black American Cowardice. Let's get it in. Wilson Pickett. Yeah. We want the code to we want that white supremacy. Yes, indeed. Where do we begin? As always, the question. And I am your gracious host, JohnGHorse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. Sometimes you just gotta bob your head to it. Wilson Pickett, baby. You understand me? Wilson, talk to him, ride out. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Sometimes you just gotta let the energy take over your spirit, family. But let's move on. And let me repeat the title of today's episode. I don't want no confusion while I'm getting into this work. And again, I am your gracious host, JohnGHorse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. And the title of today's episode is, without all the echoes, the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma Race Clash, The Legend of Horace Peg Leg Taylor, and the Myth of Black American Cowardice. You know how we do here on People Activity Radio. we like to play clips in order to get your palate ready for the work that is going to be given. And I will say here on People Activity Radio, we strive to. Our number one goal is to remove the confusion for those of us who are subject to black classification in these United States of America. And today's subject is a well-known topic for those of us who seek justice and are subject to black classification in these United States. And this well-known subject is what everybody calls Black Wall Street, what everybody calls Tulsa, Oklahoma, and or the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots. Now here on People Activity Radio, we always attempt to remove confusion, and that is an incorrect term that is shoved down our throats by the mainstream media, and that term is race riot. There was no race riot. There was a racial dislocation, population ambush, ethnic cleansing that popped off. Now you can put all those words together whichever way you want, but you get my point. If you are a frequent listener here on People Activity Radio, you've heard these terms over and over and over. Let's move on. So the title is, and I'm going to say it one more time so that I can hint at how I'm going to address this topic. The title is the 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma race clash, the legend of Horace Peg Leg Taylor, and the myth of Black American cowardice. I'm a fan of getting in the work, getting it quick, and getting out of your way, because I know those of us who are subject to black classification got things to do. And 9 times out of 10, those things to do is to make them ends meet so that you can survive the onslaught of racism, white supremacy. So the question is, who in the world is Horace Peg Leg Taylor, JohnGHorse? Before I get into that, I'm going to read a couple of passages from the new Tulsa Star, and I believe the new Tulsa Star was inspired by the Tulsa Star of Oklahoma, which was a black newspaper almost, if not 100 years ago, and the centennial of the Tulsa coup, ambush, race riot, racial clash is coming up this year in 2021. That being said, this article is titled "The Victory of Greenwood, Horace Peg Leg Taylor." Now, I know that's going to confuse a lot of us folks because we have all heard about the tragedy, the massacre, the whooping of people who were subject to black classification in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and or the Greenwood District. You understand me? Very well covered story of the whooping, almost as if the whooping is what is the goal to be embedded into your mind. So I believe the author of this article, which is titled "The Victory of Greenwood, Horace Peg Leg Taylor," I believe the author of that article is writer Carlos Moreno. And I am going to go all the way down to the paragraph that is titled "The Legend of Standpipe Hill." And that paragraph reads, "The official report of Oklahoma Commission to the Study of Tulsa Race Riot of 1921 includes information about black residents of Greenwood defending themselves during the massacre. The report chronicles that on the evening of May 31st, a gun went off when a white man tried to wrestle it from grocery store owner Obie Mann. The two mobs that had assembled in front of the courthouse, black men led by J.B. Stratford and A.J. Smitherman, who were there to defend Dick Rowland from being lynched, and the white mob who wanted to lynch him, began a furious gunfight that lasted into the early morning hours. Outnumbered and outgunned, Stratford and Smitherman's men fled back. I'm going to say that one more time. Stratford and Smitherman's men. That means it wasn't just two dudes. It was a group of men classified as black. Toting them things. Let me get back to the passage. Outnumbered and outgunned, Stratford and Smitherman's men fled back to Greenwood. However, they were pursued by the white mob and forced to take defense positions on Standpipe Hill and Sunset Hill, both located northeast of Deep Greenwood, which was the neighborhood's business district. Facts begin to blend into legend when it comes to the historical depictions of the fight on Standpipe Hill and Taylor's exploits. Peg Leg Taylor. One of the stories surrounding Standpipe Hill is that the Sunday night before the massacre, Taylor broke into Dick Barton's general store to steal ammunition. Stocking up to defend Greenwood, one would have to ask how he would have known to do this since Dick Rowland was not arrested until Tuesday morning. May 31st, National Guard Major Charles Daly stated to the Tulsa World that thousands of persons armed with every weapon available in the city, taken from every hardware and sporting goods store, swarmed on 2nd Street from Boulder to Boston. The people who stole weapons and ammunition from stores were whites from downtown, not Taylor. Just before 10 p.m. that night, another white mob stormed the National Guard Armory, demanding that Major James A. Bell give them weapons to attack Greenwood. Bell refused, and the crowd dispersed. Another account of the defenders of Greenwood comes from a written interview with Brinkley Wright in Eddie Fay Gates' book, Riot in Greenwood, The Total Destruction of Black Wall Street. Wright, who would have been 12 years old around the time of the massacre, recounts that jitneys had driven ammunition into the Greenwood area from downtown. Peg Leg and the other black defenders of Greenwood met. One more time now, wasn't just no Peg Leg. We talking about another account, talking about a group of black men toting them things, practicing counter violence. The code is the leader, and the leadership is the code. Let's move on. Behind the steps of Paradise Baptist Church. Then they made a human chain and went up the hill to defend blacks from the white mobs. They told 3 of us young black boys, Douglas, Jackson, Virgil, Whiteside, and me, that we could help to defend our people. Our job was to stay behind the steps of the Paradise Church and load and reload guns for the human chain of black defenders. The code is the leader, and the leadership is the code. Just counter racist logic. We're not sitting here trying to plead our case to these people who we have concluded mean us harm. We sitting here handling business, defending ourselves in a counter racist survival mode. Get this human chain formed. Let's start to shoot back at these folk who coming shooting at us. Now, Taylor was undoubtedly not afraid to fight, but he did not defend Greenwood alone, nor was he armed with a machine gun. There was a machine gun present at the Battle of Standpipe Hill, but it was being driven around Greenwood on a truck by National Guard leaders Major Daly and Lieutenant Colonel J.F. Rooney. Moreover, the machine gun itself was practically useless. Daly reported to reported it to be old, worn out, damaged by water, difficult to fire, and that it could only shoot one round at a time. Now, see, this is John G talking right here. I'm diverting from the article. What we're witnessing here now, I'm gonna say one more time. I'm getting this article from the new Tulsa Star.com, and the article is titled "The Victory of Greenwood, Horace Peg Leg Taylor." And I'd like to give a black self-respect salute to the new Tulsa Star, who I have concluded is a black-owned publication. Now, I could be in error, but it claims to be a black-owned publication. And my point is this. What they have done, they have gathered information from white news publications, and they have gathered eyewitness testimony from survivors or family members of survivors of the ambush/massacre in the Greenwood district, or the black side of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they are putting the pieces together. Now, see, when we're talking about these events, these massacres, these ambushes, these so-called riots in the United States, I said on the last show when I talked about the American pastime. The American pastime has always been finding wherever people who are subject to black classification are minding their business, pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, and stealing and pillaging everything that they have built. State sanctioned and federal government backed. One would say, oh, we some cowards. Why would they let somebody come into their community? You understand? I heard this all the time. Why would they let somebody come into the community, that things that they have built through blood, sweat, and tears, and perseverance, and just take it? Ain't nobody let nobody take nothing. Matter of fact, the reports read that there was groups of armed black men who went up to a jailhouse. Now, this is in 1921 now. Who went up to a jailhouse to get a young black male who had been accused of reckless eyeballing, fondling, or raping some white girl in an elevator, which he didn't do. As you can hear from a lot of the accounts that I played in the clips, there are accounts that he bumped into the girl. There are accounts that he was the elevator conductor. There are accounts that the white girl was the elevator conductor. There are accounts that they both were going together. Now, if you're from the South, going together mean they are in some type of intimate sexual arrangement. The code book calls these, when it comes to people subject to black classification and people who classify themselves as white, being in these arrangements, they call them tragic arrangements. They call them tragic arrangements because there's always seemed to be some tragic outcome historically in these United States from these arrangements. And I don't want to get into all of the intricacies of why it's tragic and who it's tragic for, but if you listen to P.A.R, People Activity Radio, you kind of get the gist. Let's move on. So we're putting all the pieces together. Don't nobody know what happened, but we do know the result. The result was this thriving, foundational black American community, which had oil tycoons, bankers, lawyers, doctors, medical facilities, everything that you can think of that a society needs for its survival. They produce and manifest it for themselves, by pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. You had white collar, blue collar, and under economy popping all up in there. Now, everybody wants to mention the under economy, but it had to pop off. You had to have some hitters and killers, because you had to have hitters and killers ready to go, always on green light for situations like this. And apparently, I suspect, and this is old John G talking, this wasn't the first time that these black self-respect warriors in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or anywhere else in the United States went up to a jailhouse and thwarted a lynch mob. But in particular, this case here with these uppity Negroes coming up here, preventing us from lynching, ambushing this young man who clearly was being targeted to be an example for the community, wasn't popping off. And as I understand it, he never did get lynched. Now, that's neither here nor there. Let's get back to the information. Now, the reason why old JohnGHorse is telling you is talking about old Peg Leg Taylor. Horace Peg Leg Taylor is. There's so much confusion and legend and folklore around this one individual. When we know it wasn't one individual, if you have any type of common sense or using common racist logic, you know it was groups of black men and women that wasn't about the back down, from my understanding. After there was a scuffle, a misunderstanding, and furniture was moving in front of the old courthouse, the jailhouse, behind them, thinking they was finna lynch the young man by the name of Dick Rowley. The law enforcement of Tulsa got involved. Now, there are reports that law enforcement not only was part of the ambush, they was knocking on doors, and if you was black and you answered the door during the ambush, when I hadn't even got into the planes and all that. See, what we're not going to do here is talk about the whooping. Why would local law enforcement or whoever did have to commandeer an airstrike on innocent women and children and elderly? Because you got to understand, the scuffle was in the streets. It wasn't in the residential community. Yet the residential community was targeted. You understand me? Now, it's one thing to destroy your competitors when you're a white business owner. You understand me? And I can understand why how the elite populace within Tulsa, Oklahoma can take advantage of this situation and fund and support the lower echelon of the white community as well as their neighbors, because what you had was, you had the members of the white community in Tulsa, Oklahoma that tried to step to the black community, and they got that work. You had law enforcement to try to assist the lower echelons of the white community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then they got that work. So you had probably the local suspected race soldier pretending to be a police chief calling on to neighboring police departments or race soldier brigades. Now, if you don't know what a race soldier is, you're going to have to revert back to my show that I did called Race Soldiers versus Police Officers. Let's move on. Now, you got neighboring vigilantes coming from outside of the community to add to the scuffle. And not only that, who had access to airplanes and TNT dynamite, dropping them down on the residential community. So now you got the folks fighting on Standpipe Hill. You understand me? Now they got to go get their family. And legend says that old Peg Leg Taylor remained an empty clip and supposedly died at the scene defending black self-respect. I want to say, whatever happened, it was more than one Peg Leg Taylor. You understand me? And I suspect that it was a conspiring effort of the Ku Klux Klan, local law enforcement, state guard, as well as state government, because the governor of Oklahoma did nothing to protect the citizens subject to black classification during this ethnic cleansing. Now, that's either true or it's not true. And I'm going to continue with, you know what, no. I'm going to leave that article alone so you can refer to this article and read some of these details that the black publication, The New Tulsa Star, wrote. The title of the article is The Victory of Greenwood, Horace Peg Leg Taylor. Very informative, a lot of constructive information. And like I said, I believe this is a black publication, and it is the new TulsaStar.com, newTulsaStar.com. Let's move on. What I found was, while investigating this incident of a lot of black self-respect, black counter-violence, I found a lot of heroism. And I also found that once the Greenwood district was destroyed, there was a lot of people subject to black classification in all areas of people activity that fought to rebuild it, and they did. You know, I hate to do these stories without coming at it from an angle of logic. And we tend to be inundated with behind-whooping Negro trauma drama all the time. Here on People Activity Radio, we just try to counter those attacks. Yes, there was a Tulsa massacre. And yes, folks classified as black took the bad end of the stick. But let me tell you something. If indeed there was a man named Horace Peg Leg Taylor and crew on that standpipe hill in perfect military strategic position, reports say there was about 300 casualties, most of which is reported to be classified as black. I'd like to say we might want to address those numbers. Yeah. They got us up out the paint in Oklahoma and rebuilt it. But during that massacre, we took some licks and they took some licks. And in order to understand how racism, white supremacy works, you have to understand your relationship to it, especially if you are subject to black classification. And your relationship being subject to black classification, being descendants of Foundation United States Black Classifieds, you are one of the only consistent groups that have stood toe-to-toe against the mechanism, the largest criminal enterprise known to mankind, that we have identified as the global system of racism, white supremacy, consistently. Even when there was no victory in sight, our brothers, our sisters, our grandcestors, our ancestors went down in a blaze of glory every time. The United States pastime again is fine and was fine, and where isn't ever people subject to black classification was who had lifted themselves up by their own bootstraps in terroristic conditions. And in spite of that fact, we survived, thrived, and for the lack of a better term, took no jive. And for all of the grandcestors who gave their life so that those women, children, and elderly could escape through the rear. Ain't nobody gonna forget you long as old John G still have breath to breathe. And in honor of Horace Peg Leg Taylor and crew, I'd like to also mention how those survivors practice a code of silence. We have to acknowledge the effects mentally that terrorism on a day-to-day basis takes on people subject to black classification. You hear story after story of survivors that have lived all the way up to the 2000s that are very apprehensive about giving their testimony to what they witnessed and how they survived and how their family survived. And there are story after story of them being terrorized not by toothless, cross-burning hillbillies. Local law enforcement would come see them if they wanted to give a correct account. And 9 times out of 10, the local law enforcement was coming to see them because local law enforcement was involved in the ambush ethnic cleansings, as we already know. This is a quick hitter, family. And I am JohnGHorse. And I hope I have contributed to less confusion. And always remember, keep learning and stay codified.
And there was a brave brother by the name of Obi Man who had his gun. And so one of the white men walked up to him and said, "Nigga, what you gonna do with that gun?" And he said, "Cracker, I'm gonna use it.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.